Below your larynx is your trachea. Your trachea is what we often call the windpipe. It's tough, but it's flexible. It's about 1 inch in diameter, and it has C-shaped cartilaginous rings in it, made of hyaline cartilage. And this prevents collapse. So you don't push air into your lungs. You suck it into your lungs by expanding your thoracic cavity, creating a vacuum, and it sucks air in. And if you've ever drank out of a straw before, right? If you had a straw made of like Kroger bag plastic, it would collapse in the middle and you wouldn't be able to get any air through or any water through. And so you need a tougher straw made of tougher plastic. Well, similarly, your trachea has to be tougher. It can't collapse when you suck air through it. And so you have these tracheal cartilages. Now, they're not total rings. They're C-shaped rather than O-shaped. And that opening goes to the back because that's where your esophagus is. And sometimes your esophagus has to expand into the area where your trachea is just a bit. And as that trachea moves down, it branches off. There's a fork, right? And it branches into your left and your right primary bronchi. Bronchus singular, bronchi plural. The right one here is larger, and it's kind of goes down at a steeper angle than this, which comes out more. And so when you choke, if you get food caught in here, you're more likely to get food caught in the right primary bronchus. And then those primary bronchi divide into secondary bronchi, and those secondary bronchi divide into tertiary bronchi. Each of the primary bronchi goes to a lung. You have 2 lungs, you have 2 primary bronchi. Your secondary bronchi each go to a lobe of a lung, and you have 2 lobes on your left lung and 3 lobes on your right lung. So you actually have 5 total lobes of lung, and you have 5 total secondary bronchi, 3 on your right, 2 on your left, and then many tertiary bronchi, each of which goes to what's called a segment of a lobe of a lung. So be sure you're comfortable with the flow of air through your respiratory system. So through your upper respiratory tract, we go into your nose and your nasal cavity and your pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, and into your larynx. And then in the lower respiratory tract from the larynx, we go to the trachea, primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, which branch and branch and branch into little bronchioles. And then we get to the pulmonary lobules, and which we'll get into a bit more detail on in a moment. But that's where we begin to have some gas exchange with alveoli. So your tertiary bronchi branch and branch into these smaller bronchioles. And these smaller bronchioles have a thick layer of smooth muscle in them, so they can get wider or narrower. And that becomes important when you want to regulate airflow. Right? They dilate when you have a sympathetic response. They constrict when you have a parasympathetic response. That's one of the reasons why if you're having an allergic reaction or asthma attack, you may take an EpiPen or some sort of bronchodilators to increase the diameter of your bronchi. And these bronchioles ultimately branch into 2 types at the end: terminal bronchioles and respiratory bronchioles. And you may think by the name that terminal bronchioles are the last and final bronchioles, but they are not. They're called terminal bronchioles because they are the end of the conducting portion of your respiratory tract. They lead to the respiratory bronchioles, which are part of the respiratory portion because there are alveoli on the respiratory bronchioles, and so you've now entered the respiratory portion of your respiratory tract, and that's why they have the name they do. And here's a full look at your trachea, to your primary bronchi, to your secondary bronchi, to your tertiary bronchi. If we follow one of these down into bronchioles, we get into our terminal bronchioles, and then you can see our respiratory bronchiole, which has alveoli on it. And here's a look at your right and your left lung. So your left lung, again, has 2 lobes, a superior and an inferior lobe, with an oblique fissure that separates it. Oblique because it's kind of diagonal. On your right side, you have a superior and inferior, but also a middle lobe. So you have this oblique fissure, but you also have a horizontal fissure separating the superior and middle lobe. Your right lobe is larger, right? And that's because on the left side, you have a heart that's taking up some of that space, and you can see where it would be in this cardiac notch. Now, while the right side is larger, it's fatter, it is actually a little bit shorter because you have a liver underneath the right side. So, your lungs are paired and they look a lot alike, but they're not identical to one another by any stretch of the imagination. But they do both have the same basic shape, and they both have a base at the bottom and an apex at the top of the cone shape that you sort of get. And they also, if you look from the medial view, so you're looking from the middle out, right? So it's as if you are the heart. You are looking out at the right lung and the left lung. You see kind of a divot, and that's called the hilum, right? So imagine a bean shape, right? The concave part of the bean, like the little spoon part. And that is where stuff comes in and out. So your pulmonary artery and your pulmonary veins come in and out, and your primary bronchi will enter the lungs at that point. Now, like your heart, you have a membrane that surrounds your lungs. And the heart membrane is called the pericardial membrane around the heart. And the lung membrane is called the pleural membrane. Pleura refers to lungs. And again, this is a serous membrane, and like the heart, it has a visceral and a parietal layer. And so the part that is directly on the lungs is called your visceral pleura. It covers the outer surface of the lungs. And then you have some space full of fluid. And then you have another layer of tissue called the parietal pleura. And this is attached to like the diaphragm and the tissue on the ribs and things like that. Now, this is important, just like around your heart, because it's slippery, and so it prevents too much friction. And that means that as you breathe, you're not going to rub your lungs raw, and you can't give your lungs that much of a rest because you need to breathe for your whole life. But it's also important because it provides a vacuum that attaches these two together. So here you can see the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura and the pleural cavity in between, which is full of pleural fluid, right? And if you've ever tried to take a slide cover off of a slide without kind of sliding off the edge first or cracking it up to get some air in there, when it's just attached with a vacuum, because there's fluid, really, really hard to pull off. Same way with a plastic bag. If it gets wet, right, that water holds it together, and if you don't get air into that water, it creates a vacuum, and it's very hard to pull apart. Same with this pleural cavity. So your parietal pleura is attached again to your diaphragm and your rib cage, and as you expand your rib cage and your diaphragm, that pulls out the parietal pleura, and because it's sort of vacuum sealed with fluid to the visceral pleura, that pulls the visceral pleura out with it, and that's what expands your lungs and allows you to breathe through negative pressure, to expand the volume of your lungs, which reduces pressure, which brings air in. If you puncture this and let air in there, then you don't have that vacuum anymore, and you can expand your parietal pleura all you want, but the visceral pleura won't necessarily follow. And when people talk about having a collapsed lung or a punctured lung, this is what they may be talking about. Here you also have a pretty good view of what happens when your terminal bronchiole, which would be here, branches into a respiratory bronchiole here. Now, the respiratory bronchiole has alveoli on it, so it's part of the respiratory portion of your respiratory system, meaning there's gas exchange, and it leads to a pulmonary lobule, which has alveoli. And so you have several alveolar sacs here. Each alveolar sac has an alveolar duct that leads into the alveolar sac, and the sac has lots of little alveoli. The alveolar sac looks like a bunch of grapes, and each grape is its own alveoli, and this provides a ton of surface area for exchange. And you'll see that all around the outside of this, there are capillaries to exchange oxygen and CO2. Now, you may also notice these sort of red rubber band looking things around the alveoli. Those are elastic fibers, so that when you breathe in, as soon as you relax the muscles that help you breathe in, right, you breathe out automatically because this elastic causes your lungs to retake their original shape. So this is your pulmonary lobule. So you got your terminary bronchiole leading to a respiratory bronchiole, which leads to alveolar ducts. Each alveolar duct leads to an alveolar sac, and the alveolar sac has lots of individual alveoli, which is where gas exchange occurs. Now, in your lungs, you have three main types of cells, specifically in the alveolar part of your lungs. Most of the cells are type 1 pneumatocytes, and these are those simple squamous epithelial cells that we were talking about. Again, they make the walls of your alveoli. They're very thin. They allow for easy gas diffusion. So these are very important, these type 1 pneumatocytes. Again, pneumo also refers to lungs. You also have roaming alveolar macrophages. This is important too because there's always going to be some dust and bacteria and gunk that makes it past all of your mucous membranes and into your alveoli, and you have to have a way to get rid of that. So you have roving macrophages that eat up all those little particles and bacteria and allow you to keep your alveoli clean. But the last type of cell, called type 2 pneumatocytes, which are simple cuboidal cells, are really important because they secrete something called surfactant. And surfactant is a special molecule that reduces the surface tension of that fluid. And here you can see those type 1 pneumatocytes, and you can see those roving macrophages. Here we are. But you also have these type 2 pneumatocytes. And this surfactant they're producing is amphipathic, which means one end is hydrophilic and one end is hydrophobic. And this is important because, again, if you've ever gotten a Kroger bag wet, it collapses together because the water on the one side is attracted to the water on the other side because it's polar, right? Water has a cohesive property. It holds together like glue, and you have to pull it out. And you don't want your alveoli to collapse. If that happens, it's really hard to breathe, right? So these amphipathic molecules in the surfactant, the hydrophilic part binds to the water. The hydrophobic part keeps the water over here from binding to the water over there and therefore reduces surface tension. This is essential if you're going to breathe. And fetuses don't make their own surfactant for a good long while until kind of toward the end of pregnancy. And if you have a premature birth, this used to be one of the main things that would prevent premature babies from surviving once they were born, is because their lungs wouldn't work effectively because there was no surfactant. But now we have artificial surfactant that you can pump into a baby's lungs and allow premature babies a better chance at survival until they can start making their own surfactant. If you zoom in on just the respiratory membrane, it's made up of the alveolar epithelium, so that simple squamous epithelial cell, it's that type 1 pneumatocyte. And then you have a capillary endothelial cell too. These capillary cells are also simple squamous epithelium, so a single squamous epithelial cell thick. And we want to make this membrane as thin as possible, so epithelial layers have a basement membrane below them made of connective tissue. These share a basement membrane, right? That's how thin this is. As thin as 0.1 micrometers, but usually about a half a micrometer. And here you can see the two cell membranes and the basement membrane here, and this is a very, very small surface that allows for very effective diffusion of oxygen from the alveolar air into the blood and from CO2 from the blood into the alveolar air so that you can exhale it. Now in the next video, we're going to talk about how we move that air into and out of the lungs and how it diffuses into the blood and back.